Let's start this final session in this shamatha retreat, observing the mind. And initially in the session, we will continue the meditation we've been doing in the last two sessions, and that is the shamatha practice, observing the mind. In other words, to observe the space of the mind and whatever mental events arise in that space. And all of these mental events are called vikalpa in Sanskrit and namtok in Tibetan. And normally this is translated as thoughts in English. So here when it talks about observing thoughts, we're talking about observing all mental events. And as we saw in the last session, often when we're observing these mental events, the more objective ones, the thoughts, the images and memories and so forth, are easier to observe. The ones that are sort of more subjective, more close to us, like our emotions and desires and reactions, often go unnoticed. So again, in this session, to really pay close attention to the more subjective mental events, particularly any sorts of reactions to anything pleasant or unpleasant that arises. And if there are no thoughts there, then simply observe that empty space and wait for the next mental event to arise in that space. And again, to adjust you can play around with adjusting the gaze if you find that you're getting drowsy or getting agitated. And also, if you're finding that you're getting constantly caught up in your thoughts, emotions, and so forth, again, maybe play with some of those short-term strategies, particularly the labeling and noting. And also, if that doesn't really seem to help, then to go back into the body and anchor yourself in the rhythm of the breath. Have that as your main focus. And then just a little bit in the corner of your mind, noticing your thoughts and so forth in the mind to help anchor yourself. So let's do that practice now. Allowing your awareness to descend into the body. Simply becoming aware of sensations throughout the body. And using the out breath to relax and release any tightness or tension in any part of the body. Softening and relaxing all the muscles in the face. In this way, allowing the entire body to become completely relaxed. And then keeping the body as still as possible, avoiding any unnecessary movement. The breathing flowing naturally and effortlessly. And allowing the mind to come to rest in the stillness of the present moment. relaxed, still, and clear. Resting your gaze in the space in front of you, keeping the eyes soft and relaxed. And now bring your attention to your own mind and observe your own mind and whatever is arising in the space of the mind. Observing thoughts, emotions, and other mental events without following them, without trying to get rid of them. Simply be like an impartial observer or witness. And in particular, paying close attention to any emotions that are arising. And specifically, any sorts of reactions to anything pleasant or unpleasant that appears. And if you're finding that you're constantly getting caught up and carried away by your thoughts and emotions and so on, you might like to experiment with labeling or noting the mental event. That is, give it a name to help avoid getting caught up. And if you're finding that you're still getting caught up in your thoughts, then you might like to experiment with anchoring in the breath. So go back into the body and focus on the rhythm of the breath. Have that as your main focus. And then just a little bit in the corner of your mind, notice your thoughts, notice your emotions. And we can bring the meditation to a close. In this session, we'll begin again with a short review, and then we'll go to the second of the two main practices for this weekend's retreat, that is the practice of resting in awareness. Then we'll look at the actual practice. We'll do a guided meditation on the resting in awareness practice, some tips for the practice, and then finish with some question answer. So quoting again from Attention Revolution, Alan Wallace is recommending three practices. To begin with mindfulness of breathing, to do this for the first 4 stages on the path to shamatha. And then once we get deeper into the practice, then from the 5th stage, his recommendation is to do the practice that we've been doing. He calls it settling the mind in its natural state, the practice of observing the mind and the thoughts that arise in the mind. And do that till about the 8th stage. And then from the 8th stage onward to shamatha, to shift to the practice we're about to introduce shortly. And that is he calls it awareness of awareness, or just the resting in awareness practice. This is often called shamatha without an object. I'll explain why shortly. With the observing the mind practice, the observing, we have these 2 variations, the observing the thoughts, the mental contents, and then turning the mind in upon itself and just resting in awareness. So we saw in the observing thoughts practice, the object there that we're focusing on is the space of the mind and whatever mental events arise in that space. And there are 3 aspects that we're observing. There's the space itself, then the mental events that arise in that space, we can sort of divide into 2 categories. The more objective type of mental events, discrete, like thoughts and images and memories, and then the more subjective type of mental events, like emotions and moods, desires, and so forth. And then we introduce these 2 short-term strategies to help us to get into the practice if we're getting distracted a lot: labeling and noting, and then anchoring in the breath. What were some of the advantages of this practice of observing thoughts? So remember, this is a shamatha practice. So the goal is shamatha, but some side benefits of the practice. One is that this practice of observing our thoughts, observing the mind, can really help us to become the masters of our mind instead of being the slaves of our mind. And we saw also there that it can be very much a healing practice because of lack of suppression of our thoughts, emotions, and memories, and so forth. So enormous benefits. And also it can be a bridge into the Vipassana practice to really come to an insight into the nature of our mind. So there's some of the extra advantages with using this as the object. Although many of you probably found this more difficult than focusing on the breath. However, again, there are enormous benefits to be had with this practice. So let's now go to the resting in awareness practice. This is given a couple of different names. We see in the quote, it was called shamatha without an object. Sometimes it's called the awareness of awareness practice, or here we're simply calling it resting in awareness. And it's really to do a lot with this sort of process of withdrawal, that with the mindfulness of breathing practice, we are withdrawing from the external world. So all the other sense objects, we're withdrawing from that, and we're becoming explicitly aware of the sensations of the breath. However, together with being explicitly aware of the sensations of the breath, we are implicitly aware of being aware of the breath. And then in the practice we've just done the last couple of sessions, we are withdrawing further. We're withdrawing from the body into the mind. And there we're explicitly aware of the mental events. And again, implicitly, we're aware of being aware of the mental events. And so in this practice of resting in awareness, we're withdrawing further. We're withdrawing from all the mental events as well, withdrawing into the mind, meaning now we are simply explicitly aware of being aware. So there's sort of this process of withdrawal here. So let's look at this practice a little bit more detail. Again, quoting from Attention Revolution, here Alan Wallace says, "Here the practice is not so much one of developing attentional stability and vividness, or in other words, clarity, as it is of discovering the stillness and luminosity inherent in awareness itself." So a little bit different perspective with observing thoughts and observing the breath and observing objects. We develop attentional stability and clarity, but here it's much more a process of discovery rather than cultivation or developing. So really one big difference here between the earlier practice of observing thoughts and even the earlier practice of mindfulness of breathing is being versus doing. This practice is much more about being than doing. And this is why many people find this practice challenging. Not because it's complicated, because it's too simple. Because basically it involves doing nothing. We don't know how to do nothing. We always want to do something. So when this practice is explained, then often people go, yeah, but what am I supposed to do? Tell me, what do I have to do? Doing is the problem. Stop doing and you'll be in the practice. So this practice is all about being. So what we're really doing here is with the mindfulness of breathing practice, we're aware of the sensations of the breath. With the practice we've just done, we're aware of the space of the mind and all the mental events arising in that space. In this practice, what we're doing is we're turning awareness in upon itself and simply knowing that we're aware. That's it. So this is also a shamatha practice. So the goal of this practice is to cultivate a calm, clear, focused mind, develop single-pointed concentration. But what are some of the unique advantages of this practice is that by simply resting in awareness, what we notice is that awareness itself is completely still and it's completely open and spacious. So by resting in that open, spacious stillness, it helps to avoid contracting around any appearances that arise in the mind. And this is going to be very helpful for us in daily life, to be able to cultivate a new default mode in daily life. Now, our default mode in daily life is that we tend to have a very tight, constricted mind. And therefore, with that tight, constricted mind, when some little stimulus comes, we easily react. A little bit like this cup here and the water in a cup. That's our mind now. It's very tight and constricted. And if we have a small pebble and we drop that pebble into the water in the cup, the surface of the water is completely disturbed. Similarly now, because our mind is tight and constricted, some little stimulus comes in our daily life and we easily react. Our mind is easily disturbed. But by doing this practice and releasing that contraction and being able to rest in open, spacious stillness, we can bring that into daily life. And that is like the analogy then of a still lake. If we have that same pebble and drop it into a lake, a still lake, there's hardly a ripple. Similarly, if we have this open, spacious stillness of awareness as our default mode in daily life, and then we have some small stimulus come, we don't get unbalanced. We don't react to that stimulus in a negative way. So that default mode is going to be very helpful. We'll be able to be much more effective in dealing with whatever comes our way, responding more effectively rather than reacting as we often do now. Also, this practice even more so than maybe the previous practice, is very much known as a bridge into the Vipassana practice, into the wisdom practice. Because simply by resting in awareness, we can really come to an intuitive insight into the very nature of our own mind, which of course is the wisdom of Vipassana practice. So this is very helpful as a bridge into the Vipassana practice. So let's look at the actual practice now, and then we'll go to the meditation. And for this practice also, like the previous practice we quoted a great 19th century Dzogchen master, Dujung Lingpa. Here we have Padmasambhava, a great 8th century Dzogchen master, who actually brought Buddhism first to Tibet, particularly this Dzogchen practice focusing on nature of mind. And so he talks about this practice in his text. He says, vacantly direct your eyes in the space in front of you. So similar to the previous practice, very much recommended here to have your eyes open for the same benefits. It helps to improve clarity of attention, helps to lock us more into the present moment, starts to break down that false sense of duality, and then we'll be able to bring this practice into daily life much more effectively. And then he says, see that thoughts pertaining to the past, future, and present are completely cut off. Cut off here doesn't mean block. It means we're not paying any attention to any appearance. Cut off means not paying any attention to them. So we're not trying to block appearances or block thoughts. We're not trying to suppress them. Let them be there. They can be there. We're just not interested in them. The only thing we're interested in is knowing that we're aware. So Padmasambhava says, bring no concepts to mind. Let the mind, like a cloudless sky, be clear, empty, and evenly devoid of grasping, and settle it into utter vacuity. So as in the previous practice, we had the analogy that the mind is like the sky and the thoughts are like clouds moving through the sky. So that practice is like observing the sky of the mind and any thoughts that pass through the sky of the mind. Here, it's more about being the sky than observing the sky. And then he says, by doing so, there arises the shamatha of joy, luminosity, and non-conceptuality. So these are three qualities of the mind that will arise more and more the deeper we go into the practice, and I'll talk a bit more about them shortly. But first, let's do the meditation now, the resting in awareness practice. So if you'd like to find a nice comfortable posture, let's begin. Setting the body into a state of relaxation, stillness, and vigilance. allowing the breathing to settle into its natural rhythm. And with each out breath, letting go of any thoughts that may have arisen, happily releasing them. And allowing the mind to come to rest in the present moment. Not doing anything at all, simply being present, knowing that you're aware. All sorts of appearances will continue to arise. Thoughts, emotions, sounds, sensations, and so on. But now pay no attention to any appearance. We're not trying to block them. Let them be there. They can be there. We're simply not interested in them. The only thing we're interested in is knowing that we're aware. So simply resting in awareness itself. And if you find yourself getting caught up in any agitation, tension, or distraction, then simply release your awareness into space, releasing all appearances and relaxing completely. And if you find yourself falling into dullness or drowsiness, then simply arouse and refresh your focus, sharpen your focus, knowing that you're aware. Resting in that open, spacious stillness of awareness. And we can bring the meditation to a close. Just some tips for this practice in terms of balancing the mind. We said earlier in this retreat, and also particularly in the mindfulness of breathing retreat, that the foundation is relaxation. That it's only on the basis of relaxation that we can cultivate any sustainable stability, clarity. And I think even more so for this practice here, that relaxation is the key, is that the harder we try, the more difficult this practice becomes. Because when we put some tension into this practice, that puts us into sort of a doing mode. And it's very hard to just rest in awareness with that tension. So really emphasize relaxation. The more relaxed we are here, the better. If we find ourselves getting caught up in agitation, tension, distraction, then as with the earlier practice, one thing very helpful for this is lowering the gaze. So if we're getting tension, particularly any tension, agitation, lower the gaze. If we're getting caught up in distraction, then just release the awareness into space, release all appearances and relax completely to really release tension, tightness, distraction. If we find ourselves falling into dullness, drowsiness, or simply having a blank mind, then what can be good here again is elevate the gaze. Just bring the gaze up, even maybe looking straight ahead, and then sharpen the focus, knowing that you're aware. And then often people ask, well, since I'm not focusing on an object here, how do I know if I'm practicing this correctly? So incorrect is if we're paying attention to any appearance. So if we're focusing on any appearance, we're distracted. So that's one way. And if there's no awareness, if we just sort of drop into this blank, unaware state, then of course we're not in the practice. So correct practice is when we're not paying attention to any appearances and there is awareness there. Of course, we can fine tune that in terms of the quality of our attention, but that is correct practice. Not paying attention to any appearance. Again, we're not trying to block any appearances. We're not trying to block thoughts or block emotions or block sounds. Let them be there. They can be there. We're just simply not interested in them. The only thing we're interested in is knowing that we're aware. And so if we do that, if we just pay attention to knowing we're aware, that's correct practice. A little bit more in terms of tips for the practice before we go to Q&A. In the quote from Padmasambhava at the end, he said, by doing this practice, there arises the shamatha of joy, luminosity, and non-conceptuality. So this practice of resting in awareness is a shamatha practice. The goal is to cultivate calm, clear, focused mind, to achieve this shamatha. But here he mentions these three qualities that come together with shamatha: of joy, or in other words, bliss. Luminosity is another word for clarity, and non-conceptuality. Actually, these three qualities will start to manifest the deeper we go into not only this practice, but any shamatha practice. As our mind becomes more relaxed, more stable, and more clear, then these qualities will start to manifest in our practice. Sometimes our mind will seem to be very clear. Other times, non-conceptuality here is really stillness. Sometimes our mind seems to be very still. Other times, very joyful and blissful. The meditation texts warn the meditators about these three meditative experiences, because all of them are very seductive. They're very nice experiences. So what happens often is when people first start to experience these joy or bliss, clarity and non-conceptuality or stillness, they go, oh, that's so nice. I like that. I want that. And so we get caught up in craving and attachment. As soon as we get caught up in craving and attachment for these, woof, they're gone. And then people go, they try to recreate it. I want more bliss. I want more clarity. I want the mind to be still with that craving mind. And of course, with a craving mind, that's a guarantee that none of these three qualities will manifest. So therefore, to let go of any craving and attachment and to simply use these experiences as signposts that our practice is on track, that we're going in the right direction, and then use these very experiences to go deeper into the practice. And then one final point here is particularly this experience of non-conceptuality. It's very easy to misinterpret this. And it's very easy to misinterpret this as an insight into emptiness. Because in the Vipassana practice of emptiness, when we come to realize emptiness, what experience do we have? We have bliss, clarity, and non-conceptuality. But there's a big difference between the non-conceptuality in an experience of emptiness and the non-conceptuality we experience here in shamatha practice. This non-conceptuality here in shamatha is simply an absence of conceptuality. We're not realizing anything. Whereas the non-conceptuality in the Vipassana practice of emptiness is a realization of non-duality, of realizing of emptiness. So therefore, important not to mistake these experiences for that insight into emptiness. Otherwise, we may think that simply because our mind has become a little bit quiet and still and non-conceptual, that somehow we've had some really high level of realization of nature of reality, when in fact we haven't realized anything. So that's a few points about these experiences that we will start to get the deeper we go into this and any other shamatha practices. So now we have some time for question answer. So anyone has any questions, again, either put your video on or the chat. Roz, is it?
Hi, Glenn. Nice to see you. I had a question about memories and how it was categorized. So in the thoughts, you categorized it as an objective thought. And I just wanted to understand that a little bit more, partly because my experience of when I have memories arise in my practice is they are very loaded with emotion, body sensation. And so I was thinking, well, in my experience, they're what you described as much more sticky, which would seem the subjective thought rather than objective. So I was interested why they were categorized over there.
The memory itself, I think, is just like, it's like an image. We remember some event or something in the past. So it's just like an image. Mm-hmm. Whereas what happens, of course, is with a lot of these memories, there's a lot of emotional charge that come with them. Mm-hmm. And so that's what I said, is that these subjective events are often in the form of reactions to objective events. Mm. So we may have a thought, we may have a memory, we may have even just an image arise in our mind. And then, but because that triggers some emotional reaction, therefore that all comes together with that. But I think the memory itself is just an image of a past event. But together with that comes often a lot of emotional charge and so forth. Also, thought. Sometimes a certain thought then triggers a lot of emotional charge as well.
So that gap is so small, it looks like it's one big blob, but it's not. It's just very fast, that connection.
Exactly. It's the same as, you know, we see a flower. Like I have a flower here in front of me. I mean, we see a flower. I mean, all that is a collection of color and shape. Mm-hmm. Right? However, you know, if I like if I like a certain color or something, when I look at that, instantly I have some craving and attachment. I want that. But is that objectively there? Because if that beauty was objectively there, it would mean everyone who looked there would have to have this, then that craving and attachment, but that's not the case. So therefore, these objective appearances themselves have no emotional charge.
Mm-hmm.
They have emotional charge because of the way in which we interpret them.
Mm-hmm.
And this is something that we talk a lot about in the Vipassana. And that's what gets us into trouble, is this sort of projecting. We're projecting and conceptualizing onto that. That's why we talked a little bit earlier about this bare attention, is that they come together so fast. It seems like it's objectively there, you know. We don't see that, we don't notice the difference between perception and conception. They happen very fast. But if we can see that link, then we can start to let go of the whole conceptual reactions to things.
Great, thank you.
We're not saying conceptions are bad themselves. In fact, we need conceptions to make sense or meaning out of the world, but we need to understand conceptions as conceptions. But what we do is we glue them onto objective reality, and we think objectively it's like that. Yeah. So this
Great, thank you very much.
Simply this sort of shamatha practice can help us to start to see that process. Okay.
Thank you.
Thanks. Anyone else have any questions?
Glenn, I have one question, Mikkel from Copenhagen, regarding the emotions as the object of attention or awareness. So it seems that emotions both have this story aspect, or this cognitive aspect of there is an event and a story about it, and then there's this almost bodily sensory reaction to it. So I'm curious which part of the emotion we are paying attention to in this particular practice of observing the mind.
Yeah, that's a good point too. Is again, then often emotions have a corresponding physical manifestation in the body. In this practice of observing the mind, observing thoughts and emotions, we're only observing the mental aspect. But what can be helpful as a short-term strategy is not so much in the shamatha practice, but more in daily life, because in daily life, we want to be able to also observe our thoughts and emotions without reacting to them, getting caught up in them. So what we can do is, if we're not able to do that, and this practice of observing thoughts and emotions can help us to be able to do that in daily life, but in daily life, if we're not able to do that, then as a sort of a short-term strategy, what we can do is shift the attention from the mental aspect to the physical aspect, the sensory aspect, tactile aspect. So then have a look at what's happening in the body corresponding to that emotion or that reaction, because then it's a more non-conceptual space, the body, and it'll be a little bit easier to observe these various sensations that are going on in the body together with the emotion that is arising in the mind. But in here, in this shamatha practice, we're not particularly paying attention. We're not paying attention to the bodily aspect of the emotion that is mentally arising. In fact, we're not paying attention to any sensory objects in this shamatha practice of observing thoughts. However, what often happens is that when some sense object arises, some sound, some visual object or some sensation in the body, then immediately or very shortly afterwards, we then get caught up in that sense. We see something and then we have a thought about it. We hear something, we have a thought about it. And so that even though the sense object itself we're not observing, what more often than not happens if there is some, if it's pleasant or unpleasant, immediately following that will be some mental event, some reaction to that pleasant or unpleasant sense object. And that we pay attention to, because that's where we start to go astray, is in that mental reaction to sensory input.
So is it almost kind of like a judgment? This emotional reaction is a judgment of pleasant or unpleasant, or is it more complex than that as well?
Well, I'm not sure judgment. I mean, judgment. I'm not sure judgment's the right word, but certainly from a Buddhist perspective, is we have a distorted view of those sensory objects. And as a result, we react then with attachment to pleasant, aversion to unpleasant. And that's something that we'll be addressing in a lot of detail in the later retreat when we talk about the Vipassana practice.
Yeah, thank you.
Sure. Anyone else have any questions? We still got plenty of time.
Yes, I'm the other Mikkel.
Other Mikkel? Mikkel number 2.
Yes, I was number 4 in kindergarten, so that's okay.
Okay.
This relates to what you just discussed. So when you observe the mind, what I experience sometimes is that when I start to notice the thoughts coming up and I let go of the thoughts, I will have like a immediate or kind of fast after emotional reaction to it. Like if some old stuff comes up. You talked about, how Alan Wallace talks about shamatha is also, you start to become aware of all the stuff going on in your mind. I do have attachment, What do you do with that? I mean, because sometimes in a lot of other settings, I've been taught, when stuff comes up, stay with it, sit with it, let the emotions pass, if you have sorrow, grief, whatever. There's just some of the stuff that you said before seemed to go a little bit against that, or should I just stay with it and then let it pass and then release it and then go back to being observing, or how would you deal with that? Or should I go see a psychologist and come back and do the meditation after,
But I mean, that's
right. Yeah.
Well, that's what I was saying with the earlier practice we're doing, observing thoughts and emotions. It's very much a healing practice. Exactly, this is the point, is we're doing this practice, and what happens is that we have a lack of suppression. So what normally happens now in our daily life is we either consciously or unconsciously suppress a lot of things. And if we do this practice and really get into the practice, then even that unconscious suppressing is released. And so a lot of stuff will start to come up, and it needs to come up because holding it down is causing us a lot of psychological and physical problems. And so if we're in this practice and we are really developing the ability to simply observe thoughts and emotions without getting caught up in it, then as I mentioned, this is very much a healing practice, because often simply acknowledging those things we're suppressing heals. And if not, it's the beginning of the healing process. So yes, when you're doing this practice, if a lot of sadness comes up, you just keep observing that. So when I talked earlier about releasing thoughts doesn't mean let's get rid of them. Releasing means to see thoughts as thoughts, to not get caught up in them, to not grasp onto them. That's what release means. So by releasing thoughts, we can observe them, and the energy that they cause problems just dissipates. So we just stay with them. That's what it means to release them. Does that make sense?
Yeah. Yes, I think it does. Yes. So in a way you let the event pass of the releasing of whatever emotional energy, for example. I mean,
yeah,
if something
exactly.
comes up, just
So
let it pass,
again,
but without grasping onto it and staying
sure,
with
exactly. As we saw in the stages of the release, there is that once we become better at observing rather than grasping and suppressing and following, then these thoughts and emotions actually have no power to harm us. I mean, if we've been suppressing them and they come up, they may have a lot of like energy to them, but actually we can simply be fully present with that strong emotion, and it can't overwhelm us. It can't overwhelm us. And it may stick around for a while because it has a lot of energy to it, but we can stay with it. We can stay with it, and then it'll pass.
Yeah, I heard someone said it will whelm though.
Sorry?
I heard someone say then it won't overwhelm us, but it will whelm. But anyway.
Yeah, but I mean, these are things that we've been suppressing, so we need to release them. We need to not suppress them. So if they come up, that's good. We just stay with them and let them pass.
Perfect. I agree. I just wanted to clarify that. Thank you so much for a good.
Good point. I think we've still got time for at least one more question before we wrap up. Okay, seems like there's no more questions, so maybe we'll leave it there. So tomorrow we'll have the same schedule as today, and we'll continue this resting in awareness practice in the first session tomorrow. And then following that, in the next two sessions, what we'll do then is we'll combine the two practices that we've done today. That is the observing the thoughts and the resting in awareness. And that's called stillness in motion. So we'll spend a bit of time on that practice for a couple of sessions. And also in those sessions, we'll have a look at this standard model for shamatha. So this color chart and diagram that you should all have. So we'll be looking at those. And then in the last session tomorrow, we'll be looking at how to integrate these practices into daily life. And also we'll be looking at, in that conjunction with that, we'll be looking at these prerequisites that we already looked at in the earlier retreat, but we'll address them again, how to set up our life to support this sort of practice. And then also in terms of a worldview, to cultivate a healthy worldview to support this practice as well. So these are some of the topics that we'll be covering tomorrow. So that's it for today. So until then, enjoy your evening or day, and see you tomorrow morning at 9 o'clock Central European Summer Time. So bye for now.